This is Beyond the Brand with Dontaye Carter, where we go behind the scenes and tell stories about some of today's most dynamic brands, businesses, and the people behind them. So sit back, relax, and listen to Beyond the Brand. Beyond the Brand. Beyond the Brand. Beyond the Brand.
What's up, world? What's going on? Dontaye Carter here with a new edition of Beyond the Brand. We've been gone for a long minute. We had a lot that was going on, and that was one of the reasons why I wanted to bring on my good friend, attorney Gerald Griggs, to talk about what went on this past year, the election, what we're doing with Justice Media, and really ensuring that we're providing the best information out to our listeners, right? How they can run for elected office, how they can fundraise, and how they can make a difference in their community. So without further ado, Gerald, I'm passing it over to you.
What's going on, Dontaye? It's always good to be on the platform. And yeah, it was a lot going on with a lot of elections on a municipal level, state level. And it's just interesting watching Georgia politics and national politics and really having this robust conversation. So I'm honored to be on here to have this conversation.
Awesome. Well, go ahead and kick things off. Let's start off with talking about the Sandy Springs mayoral race. You can start talking about some things that you saw, things that we can really add on to the conversation that people didn't know what was going on behind scenes, that, really ensuring that we're painting a better picture, an overall picture. Because, it was a historic election. They needed historic numbers to still secure that seat. And just what we did, what the people did, cannot be understated at all.
Yeah, it really can't be understated. And, from the kickoff of the election, which happened during the course of the Count Every Vote, Protect the Vote rallies down at the State House, to the ground game, from the door knocking, unprecedented numbers of door knocking and phone banking and text banking, to social media. I think people really didn't understand how big a push was going on in Sandy Springs to get the word out. So I applaud you for that, your team for that. I think it also showed in the numbers of responses. I think many of the media outlets called the race entirely too soon. And we know now we're really seeing the energy around whatever comes next. But it was a profound turnout, engagement. And I think people are witnessing a historic change, not only in Sandy Springs, but in the course of Georgia politics. So my hat's off to you and the team. I think, my view was one who hadn't really been in Sandy Springs politics, but just seeing the engagement of new voters getting activated and the bridges being built across party lines, but also in the party to see that new voices are coming to the forefront. I think you had the most candidates ever in a municipal election in Sandy Springs in this past election. And I think that showed with the first ever African-American being elected to council and the number of turnout. It was a historic race. I think over 15,000 voters engaged in that race, in a race that usually has about 7,000. So, doubling the number that came out was awesome. And I think it's just a symbol of what's to come.
Yeah, and I think the thing that we can't understate either is the fact that we had the highest voter turnout per capita in the state of Georgia. You look at everywhere from cities that were larger than us, same size or even smaller, and the number of people just per capita that showed up, I think that just can't be understated. And right now we're in the midst of something astronomical that's about to happen and about to go down as well, right? We have Purdue making his announcement today, him and Kemp, the drama around there. And we've got our golden girl, who we know is going to be the next governor of the state of Georgia, Stacey Abrams. And I just thought it was so funny that these two men haven't wasted any time taking shots at her, who she is, what she stood for, bringing on this narrative of it's the California New Yorkers, not realizing that a majority of us are either from here, our families came from here, and we've just come home.
Yeah. I think they continue to miss the boat in forgetting what started in 2016 was a wave of activism that we've never seen politically. That wave ushered in a host of new candidates and a host of new now elected officials. But the wave started the day after the inauguration of Donald Trump, when the resistance was born in Georgia. And many of the people that were standing on that stage that were not elected officials are now elected officials, whether that's John Ossoff, who's now the senator from this state, Raphael Warnock, who's a part of the march, who's now a senator from this state. Of course, Kwanzaa Hall, who was the preceding congressman from the 5th district after John, unfortunately, passed away. John was there. And of course, the next governor of the state of Georgia, Stacey Abrams, was there. And so I think that David Perdue and Brian Kemp have underestimated the reverberation on the ground that was born that day. We saw after that the flipping of the Senate. We saw the flipping of the House of Representatives. We saw the changing of the guard from the presidency. And then we saw, of course, what happened in Georgia, 2020. But it was all born out of that activism, which led to the election in 2018, where Ms. Abrams, Leader Abrams, came up a little short. So I think that, by attacking her, I think you underestimate the progressive power in Georgia and the new electorate that is here. They tried to suppress and silence the voices of many millions of voters in Georgia. Nobody's coming from the outside. They're not coming from California. They're not coming from New York. This is the voice of real Georgia. And so I think people will be engaged. I'm supremely happy that she's announced. And now we got to get busy mobilizing people. So I think that, all the new grassroots organizations that were born out of that movement have continued to register voters. Georgia has a 95% voter registration
95
percentage. So now we just got to mobilize people. And I think we will be able to do that around this candidate and around a new progressive slate.
So what's the message? I mean, there have been so many things that we've heard from so many different people about how do we get those historic numbers out again? How do we reach people? How do we touch them where they are? There's been a lot of backlash towards Joe Biden. His percentage points, as we know, are low. Many progressive states having him at 47%. And folks want to know how do we keep it going? How do we keep the energy up in Georgia?
Yeah, I think the way we keep the energy up is to continue to double down on the message. The message is the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. The message is the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. The message is protecting healthcare. All these things that you saw people marching in the streets for, you got to double down on that message. You got to speak directly to your constituency. In Georgia, the base of the Democratic Party are African Americans, both African American men and African American women. We got to talk about those kitchen table issues that are confronting them. We got to talk about student loan debt. We got to make sure we talk about, again, the unprecedented voter suppression that is continuing to happen here. We got to talk about SB 202. All the things that you hear about at the protests. We got to talk about police accountability. So I think to engage them and get them motivated, you have to put their issues first, not trying to dictate from Washington what the issues are, but listening to the ground. And I think the ground is quite clear. We need the passage of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. We need the passage of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, or some executive orders that address this. I think in the gubernatorial race, if Leader Abrams goes back to her platform of 2018 and it embraces many of those themes, but also talks about what's been happening for the last two and a half years, I think she will engage and motivate the base to get out. I think that we have to speak not only to urban Georgia, but to rural Georgia. I think a lot of people miss that. There's a different Georgia in South Georgia. There's a different Georgia in Middle Georgia. We got to talk about what happened down in Brunswick. You cannot run away from that, because that energized the entire nation and started Freedom Summer 2020. So I think if she focuses on those issues and has a robust conversation about policy that she will change in her first 100 days, she will be able to get the vote out in unprecedented numbers. You can't suppress 61%. You can't suppress 70%. You can't suppress 75%. That's what we're going to need, that type of turnout in Georgia. If she does that, she'll be the next governor from the state.
And that's one of the things that I saw, and I appreciate you sharing those and giving context to what we're against. One of the things that I found even disappointing, even in my run for Sandy Springs mayor, was how the media covered the race, how they covered, especially having a Black person in the race, They didn't give it the context and the care that was needed to really, not just me, but any of the candidates, put them in a complete perspective. Everything was just very one-sided. Oh, he's just running because of George Floyd. It always had to be one isolated issue, and it couldn't have been linked to why we had the historic numbers that showed up. I mean, what we saw and what we're continuing to see is a movement around Black families that is going. It's not just Black Girl Magic or Black Boy Joy. It is Black families running for more, right? Running for more accountability, running for more access to the polls, running for more of a right just to be recognized as a citizen of this country. How do we continue from a media standpoint to push that narrative out to where they're telling the story in its totality and in its context without layering it with division?
I think that we have to use platforms like this one to allow our voice to be unfiltered. I think a lot of times the media tries to inject itself into the conversation instead of just reporting on the conversation. Like I said before the resistance, we were motivated and marching in the streets for Black Lives, 2015, 2016. And then we saw the rise of Donald Trump, and we had to broaden our tent. Of course, we love all the individuals in our tent, that fight for progressive policies. So I think that for African Americans, we have to make sure that we centralize our focus and our narrative because we are being ignored right now. In the presidential race, South Carolina delivered the nomination and Georgia delivered the White House, and then Georgia delivered the Senate. And the majority of those voters were African Americans. And so I think that we have to speak to those voters. We have to have deliverables for those voters, voting rights, of course, protection from unlawful encounters with police, dealing with economics and education. These are things that have to be spoken to. Of course, healthcare. And I think one of the motivating factors in this upcoming gubernatorial race is what the Supreme Court does with abortion rights. We have to remember that the heartbeat bill started here. A lot of things start here. So I just think that people need to make sure that they're hearing the voices of the disenfranchised, the ones that have been on the front lines, the ones that have been fighting for such a long time, and make sure that in the big tent that is the Democratic Party, that you're speaking directly to the ringmasters that are in that big tent, the ones that drive the conversation.
What's crazy? When we talk about those deliverables, right? I know people keep talking about infrastructure and all these things. To me, that's low-hanging fruit, right? It's, of course, we've got to take care of our roads and our infrastructure. That's low-hanging fruit. But I want to see us get beyond that low-hanging fruit. Like the fact that we don't have leaders who are taking strong stances on reproductive rights, on police accountability. I mean, there's becoming folks are disenchanted with just those talking points. They want to see more. They want to see action meet legislation, and it's not taking place. It's not happening at all. And I mean, that's part of the reason you see all these pictures behind me. These are the faces of injustice. And until we start to really get justice, get accountability, and move this country forward in a way where we're actually bringing people along, I mean, where else are people going to go besides the streets?
Yeah, I mean, you got to speak to the issues, and you can't sugarcoat it anymore. From Philando Castile to Alton Sterling, to Sandra Bland, to Jimmy Atchison, to Feltavius Griggs, to Oscar Kane and Kane Rogers, and just so many others. Of course, the big names that everybody knows, George Floyd and Ahmaud and Breonna. It's so many names, and we have to address these issues, and it comes to being heard at the ballot box. Many times in the protests, we always tell them to motivate their frustration out at the polls. But when you see unprecedented voter suppression and people talking about people as if they come from some other place and they're not a part of the conversation here in Georgia, it motivates them even more. And so I just think that our politicians have to speak directly to the pain that many people are feeling and to address that pain and to correct the wrongs. I think that, in Metro Atlanta, we've seen that a lot in the movement. We see it now in Southeast Georgia, and I think we will see it across the whole state. And I think that if you tap into that feeling, people will be motivated to come out. But you have to provide them deliverables. You cannot
Yeah.
have stump speeches with promises, and then once you get elected, you forget about those individuals. So
Yeah.
my hope is, in the gubernatorial race, you will see that same energy, but you got to speak directly to them.
Yeah. And speaking of speaking directly, I love to talk about all the boy dads out there, but the reality is we're fathers of daughters. I know how that inspires me each and every day in this pursuit of justice. What does that mean for you, and what is the legacy that you're fighting to leave behind as well?
Well, the happiest day of my life was when I saw the eyes of my daughter open, and I realized that there was something bigger than me that I had to take care of. And so it means the world to me to be a father, but more importantly, it means the world to me to be a father of an African-American female, a little girl, daddy's little girl. And so, it helps to fuel why I do what I do. It also helps me to fully contextualize the full scope of the battle. I think when we just talk about you're fighting for one group of people or one sect of the community, when you actually have to look outside yourself for your children and make sure that society humanizes them.
Yeah.
They are human. They have emotion. They feel pain. And so I think that, the injustice that's happening, looking at her eyes and making sure that I leave a better place than the one I found is my driving motivation. So I'm just honored to be called father or dad, and it drives me.
And I think one of the things that in a very disgusting way, right, that also inspires me. And I say disgusting because I just hate to see it, and I hate to hear it, but the conversation around Black men, and Black men particularly as fathers. And I don't think people realize that the ones that are really out here doing the work, what we sacrifice in order to make sure that not only are our children taken care of, but our children have a place in this world where they feel seen, they feel heard, they feel recognized. Because that's ultimately what we care about. A lot of people can say this, that, or the third, or however they want to paint this picture. But the reality is, as protectors, we're always thinking about the world that our children are entering. And that's what leads us into politics and these other spaces, is because we know the dangers that lie ahead. And when we see the lack of accountability in all facets of this country, it's the most frustrating part. People forget 50 years ago. When I say 50 years ago, like it was long. We still got people being lynched right now. And until we get a grip on these things, how are we supposed to feel as fathers? That sense of, I've never been one to sit in that pool of helplessness, wondering who's going to protect my child. If I got to vote every person out of office in this country to protect my child, I'm willing to do it. And so for the brothers out there that are in the same boat as us, what's the message that you want to send to them?
The message is, it's not 1850, it's not 1950, it's 2021. And if we want a better place for our children than the one we inherited, we have to get out there and do some things. Yeah, I know there's stereotypes all over the place about the lack of Black fathers and lack of accountability. That's all BS. I know too many good fathers out here that are fighting, that are providing, that are doing what's necessary to move our community forward. Let's end that narrative by speaking up, by using our voice, by making sure people know that we exist and that we have been on the front line since the very beginning, that we stand shoulder to shoulder with our sisters. We've always stood shoulder to shoulder. We can't, we weren't around when the mistakes of the past were made, when certain people weren't lifted up in spaces in the movement, but we can sure make space now, but we also cannot allow our voices to be muted. And so I think to the brothers out there, what I would say is join us on the front lines. There would be no battle if it wasn't for Black fathers holding up Black family. And there wouldn't be any battle without us being supportive, us being leaders, us being there to provide assistance. All these things, there are places and roles, especially in the political arena. For far too long, Georgia has been seen as a place where one dominant male has always led. And let's be clear in that. It was not Black men. And so now that we are talking about diversity, let's be very specific in what diversity looks like. Diversity of thought also includes diversity of experience, whether that's African-American men, African-American women, our Latinx brothers and sisters, our LGBTQIA individuals, our AAPI brothers and sisters. All of us deserve a seat at the table, and there's room at the table. And if they don't make room at the table, we'll make our own table, because Georgia will be a majority minority state in a few years. If it's
it already is. We already here.
So let's have a conversation. At the top of the ticket, we need diversity.
Yeah.
People forgot we're the ones that sent David Perdue home. It had nothing to do with Donald Trump. After the election in 2016, we tried to have a conversation with David Perdue every single day outside his office, to the extent that he moved his office from downtown to Buckhead. So we decided to send him home. He hadn't asked our permission to get back into Georgia politics. And so we need to send him another message. For Brian Kemp, we tried to have conversation with him when he was the Secretary of State. We tried to have conversation with him while he was a governor. Now, Mr. Kemp, Governor Kemp is getting it from both sides. He's getting it from the progressives and he's getting it from MAGA. But he needs to understand that Georgia is diverse, and the same people that elected 2 new senators are going to elect a new governor. And we're going to hold that person accountable. There's a new level of accountability. We're not just marching in the streets now. We're putting people in elected office. We're holding them accountable to the policies. Many people are talking about this current administration. We're going to hold them accountable. We'll be in DC tomorrow to hold them accountable to the promises that they made. So we're in a new political reality. That means that not only are we going to vote, but we're going to hold you accountable to every single campaign promise. And for the individuals that didn't live up to their campaign promises, weren't transparent, you're not getting a second seat at the table. You're not going to be governor. You're not the senator. You've been sent home. Nobody's asked you to come back and to join in our political conversation. We're moving forward, not backwards. It's about diversity and inclusion, not regression and depression. You wouldn't even want to talk about taking Confederate monuments down and providing health care and doing the simple things for Georgia. So what makes you think you should be the governor?
Yeah. And that's the key. The reality is we're literally forcing the old guard into retirement, forcing them. We're pushing them out. They're not ready to go. We understand that, but it's not about what they want. It's about what the needs of this state actually are. And I find it funny that all these folks talk about us bringing national politics into their communities when Perdue is running off of a Trump endorsement, and Herschel Walker, people who aren't in our community,
Trump is not from Georgia. Respectfully, I loved Herschel Walker as a football player, but Herschel does not live in Georgia.
Nope.
We're talking about real Georgians, people that have been here for 40 years, people whose grandparents were here and their great-grandparents were here, and they were ignored. But that's not going to happen anymore. So unless you have policies that speak to the entire community, you're going to become irrelevant, which is why you're trying to suppress your way back into power. If you are suppressing your way into power, you're not speaking for the voices of the majority. And so respectfully, for members on the other side of the aisle, we're putting a hand out. The hand is, if you want to have a big tent, get rid of the white supremacists in your party. Start talking about policies that speak to inclusion and not exclusion. Don't go back to 1850 or 1950. Don't have white supremacists directly running in your party. And then we will have a conversation with you. Otherwise, you're going to continue to lose elections. You lost the popular election in 2016, which you won the Electoral College. You lost both the popular election and the Electoral College in 2020. Then you lost the Senate after losing the House. And so what you need to understand is that same base that elected all of these individuals are still out there. And now they're holding their elected officials who they elected accountable. But we would do the same thing, if you try to run again. So I feel comfortable that we'll get the vote out. I think that new policies will be implemented, progressive policies that speak to a large majority of Georgia, as Georgia is becoming more and more diverse. And we're not just talking about Metro Atlanta. We're talking about rural Georgia, where we are all the time. We're talking about middle Georgia, where we saw a wave of progressive candidates statewide take mayoralships around the state.
The sister from Warner Robins. Yeah.
Sister from Warner Robins, the brother down there in Glenn County, in Brunswick, and all over the state. You're seeing a rise in municipal elections, which will spill over into state elections as well.
Yeah. Oh, we definitely, there's definitely going to be some big changes. And, you know, I'll say this, Leader Abrams said it best. You know, you change the politics in the state of Georgia, you're going to change the politics in the South, you change the politics in the South, and you're going to change the nation. And that's where we got to move to. This country isn't as vanilla as people still want us to believe it is. And the reality is they just going to have to learn to share. Y'all learn to share, we'll learn to be quiet, period.
Yeah. And I mean, it's real easy to share. There's enough pie to go around.
Yeah.
You know, there's enough pie for the brown people and the black people and the Asian people and the LGBTQ people. But we just got to realize that because we are enforcing our right to the table does not mean that you're losing a piece of your part of the pie.
But they are.
Pie.
There's enough pie, but they're not used to sharing the pie.
But it was never their full pie the whole time.
Well, but you got
they need to understand is that some people have been here since the beginning of this country. Mm-hmm. Some people helped found this country. Mm-hmm. Some people, ancestors fought and died in every single American conflict. And it's time to start recognizing that more than just a federal holiday for Juneteenth. We're talking about full expansion of voter rights and voter protections. We're talking about full civil rights. So you don't have to worry about in 2020 or 2021, an African-American being hunted and lynched in a community simply because they thought he didn't belong there. We're talking about full protections against state-sanctioned violence. We shouldn't even be talking about state-sanctioned violence, but we are. And so those are some of the things, as well as, of course, reproductive rights and healthcare and all of the things that are part of a progressive platform, not having student loan debt up the wazoo when you graduate because you were told by your parents to go get a great education and now you have all this debt. So these are just a few of the things that we have to have a conversation about, and we're having that robust political conversation. And we're also bringing along people who typically don't have this conversation. I'm appreciative of celebrities finally getting involved. I'm appreciative of athletes getting involved. Yeah. We need more of that so we can make sure the message is clear to our constituency that elections matter, your vote matters. If it didn't matter so much, they wouldn't be gerrymandering and they wouldn't be suppressing it.
Yeah. And we're going to have to push them. We're going to have to push the envelope because despite the fact that we have ancestors that fought in every war that involved this country, right? We have ancestors that were slaves that worked without receiving a penny, you know? I mean, and we got people out here working and still barely making ends meet because they don't want to address this minimum wage, which they could have based off inflation and kept people on par, but they didn't. And so real time, we're going to have to teach these folks how to share. And we're going to have to continue to stand tall and force them to understand that, you know, we've got as much invested in this country as everybody else, regardless of our color and however they want to frame it, our gender and what they believe we should have. No, we've got enough invested just like anybody else. And we're going to continue to push for those same results.
Yeah, I agree with you, brother. And I think that's why it's important for us to have these platforms so people can have the real conversation that's happening on the streets, that are happening in the suites, that are happening all around the state, both in the mountains and on the beaches and in the plains and in the metro area. And so I think that what people need to understand is Georgia politics has fundamentally shifted. Yeah, not shifting backwards. We are ready for different leadership at the top, leadership that thinks different, that responds to the entire electorate, that's ready to move forward and not backwards. Yeah, that's not talking about some far gone era in Georgia history, but that's talking about the next horizon for technology and innovation and change in Georgia. That keeps Georgia number one for business, but also makes Georgia the social justice leader of the country.
And if you are in the media and you are telling these stories, you need to do a better job of telling these stories in their context. We are way beyond you telling these stories through the eyes of who you deem to be the majority. It's time for you to start telling these stories in full context. It's time for you to start shading in the areas of gray, because the reality is the gray areas only exist because you've told a really bad story for a very long time. And that's why these platforms exist. That's why we're on shows like Beyond the Brain. That's why you've got so many political shows, Keeping It PC, so many, because you failed to address these things. And we're tired of hearing about politics through a very biased lens. We're tired of waiting to be treated as human beings. I mean, that's what all of this just comes down to. And so we're going to continue to grow these platforms. We're going to continue to talk to not just the state, but we're going to talk to the world. We're going to let every community that's been disenfranchised and oppressed know that by coming together, you can make changes that are going to benefit each and every one of you.
Yeah, definitely. And I just think that, we're in a different reality with the rise of the internet, with the rise of new platforms. So this is a calling together of all interested parties. The media has a big role to play. Yeah. You fueled what happened in 2016. And if you continue to fuel what's happening now, we will respond.
When they fueled it, they fueled the insurrection,
And with massive nonviolent, peaceful protests, but also with political change. And, it doesn't need to come across as if this magically happened, out of the sky and y'all didn't see this stuff coming. There were massive protests, which led to massive social change. We've seen this before. We'll see it again. My respectful request is that you start talking to many of the leaders who are around. This stuff does not happen in a vacuum.
Nope.
And start talking to the people on the ground, the people that are doing the work to mobilize the voters, to make sure the voters stay engaged. Have that conversation with them. Understand that there's a new political reality in Georgia that's going to continue to change, and that we are on the precipice of a new reality that will be inclusive of all Georgians and all of the individuals that want to become Georgians. Stop with all the buzzwords about California or New York, or there's another group of people coming in and changing our way of life. This is our way of life that is inclusive of all Georgians. And if you really think that the old way of life was so great, why don't you have a conversation with some of the older Georgians who are a different complexion, who love a little differently, who have been oppressed for centuries, and you will see that the old way was not appropriate. And so, we are really calling people in. We're calling people to understand and to make space. But make no mistake about it, we're going to make our own space. We're just asking, as kindly as we know how, for you to understand that there's a new reality, and we're not passing on oppression and hatred to the next generation from what we inherited. We're going to continue to move forward. We're going to make sure that the law applies equally and justly to all citizens of Georgia. And then we're going to make sure our politicians are responsive. We've been down to the Gold Dome too many times. There are too many statues of only one type of Georgian. There are no Asian statues of Asian Georgians. There's no real Black statues, with the exception of Dr. King. In that rotunda. There's definitely no women. And so my question, were there no great Georgians of any of those other complexions or genders or identities?
And what about the Native Americans?
Well, they got one Native American in there, and we don't even want to talk about that. But we got to really have this conversation in a robust fashion. Georgia is diverse. Georgia will continue to become more diverse. We don't need to be like Florida is right now with Ron DeSantis. Okay. Florida is diverse, but we just got to engage the electorate that feels disenfranchised. But we're going to start in Georgia and let it send a message out to the rest of the country.
Yeah, and this is why we've got shows like Beyond the Brand. I want y'all to also tune in to Justice Fighter Network, because we're getting deeper in these. It's time to get people on the internet airwaves who are really putting these stories into context, because that's what's missing from this entire conversation is context. So listen, we're going to keep doing it. We're building out Justice Media Network. Go to justicemedianetwork.com. We got a social media platform that we've set up. You can talk, you can engage, you can post everything that you do on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, you can do on Justice Media. And it's time for us to start building platforms that reflect us, that value our opinions, and that us that I'm talking about, the us is those people pushing for progress, that us is those people pushing for inclusion, that us is those people pushing for equity. And I just want to thank you all so much. Continue to tune in. We'll be dropping new podcast episodes every week. Gerald will be doing the same. Keep tuning in, and let's continue to have this conversation and really push to make sure that we can have, or not just have, but create the society that the generations that come after us can be proud of. Thank y'all so much. Gerald, thank you for tuning in. Appreciate you, brother.
Thank you.
Beyond the brand, beyond the brand, beyond the brand.